Okay, I'm going to show how I make my pizza crust. You're going to need 6 ingredients. You're going to need water heated to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. This is 3/8 cup. This will be for a small 10-inch pizza. And yeah, I use a microwave to heat the water up. Use a thermometer to make sure it's 110. You're going to need a little bit of sugar, half teaspoon of salt, 1 tablespoon of olive oil. Use a good quality olive oil. 1 cup of flour, 1/2 teaspoon of yeast. I use the special pizza crust yeast. You're going to want something to let your dough rise in, covered. I use a pot with a cover, and I give it a little bit of water too while it's rising to keep the humidity up. And something to keep it warm, I use my toaster oven. You're going to want to let that dough rise in the heat for about an hour. So we just measure out half teaspoon of yeast here. Put that in. The recipe calls for a lot of sugar. I just put a little sugar in. You want a little sugar to give the yeast some food. I don't put very much in. And you stir this up. This is half the ingredients right here. This is the water, the sugar, and the yeast. And make sure your temperature isn't too much higher than 110, or I think you kill the yeast. I've made that mistake before and the dough didn't rise. There's many ways to screw up the dough, but once you've done it a couple times, it should come out pretty good. And the way I'm making this, I let it sit in the fridge for a couple of hours. If you want to make a really good dough, you want to let it sit in the fridge overnight. But I think this is good enough. So I'm going to fast forward, and we're going to let this, you should see it foam in about 15 minutes, and we'll come back and we'll do the rest of it. Okay, here's the next part for making our pizza crust. We've come back magically 15 minutes later, and as you can see, our water, yeast, and sugar experiment is starting to foam. That's a good sign. That means your yeast is alive, and it's probably going to make some good crust. For the rest of it, we're going to need 1 cup of flour. I use a little bit less than 1 cup, because if I use 1 cup of flour, I always have to add a little water. So I'm a little chubby anyway, so I'll cut down on the flour, so use a little bit less flour. Some salt, and your olive oil. So the first thing you want to do, we're going to add 1 tablespoon of olive oil. And I've measured these big spoons out. These are pretty much exactly 1 tablespoon, and I've got my smaller spoons are 1 teaspoon. Just kind of stir it in. Of course, I won't mix. Put in 1/2 teaspoon of salt. Stir that in. And by the way, this was kept warm on top of my toaster oven over here. I use a toaster oven top to keep everything warm. Final ingredient is the flour. A little bit less than 1 cup of flour. and try to stir as best you can't really mix the water and oil, of course, but just kind of stir it as best you can. Just pour it in there. Get a little more flour out. Some people will use you can use a mixing bowl if you want. I don't have a mixer, but you can get one. They're kind of expensive, but probably well worth it. I think you can just mix it by hand. It's not a big deal. What you want to do is you want to kind of knead it a little bit. That way that olive oil gets mixed in there real good. And again, this is for a 10-inch pizza, which is a small. I think that's a pretty big meal for one person, for myself. If you want to make a large, you can double this up. I find a large pizza, it's enough. It's like 3 dinners for me, so, and I don't feel like eating pizza every night of the week, so I'll just make a small pizza and either eat it all in one day or dinner one day and lunch the next or something like that. And you want to kind of make a ball. You can coat this in flour. A lot of people will coat this in flour and let it sit. You can let it sit on a cutting board and cover it with a, I think they cover this, you can coat this in flour, and they coat this, or they cover it with like plastic saran wrap, and just let it sit out on the, just let it sit out on your counter for about an hour. Okay, but what we're going to do is we're going to cover it. This is the way I make it. I don't coat it. I've got a little extra water in here. This keeps it humidified. And I leave my spoon in here. You can do whatever you want, I don't care. And then I cover it. You want to cover it. And you want to keep it warm. I keep it warm again on my toaster oven for about an hour. You come back and it should get a lot bigger. It should expand. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to just fast forward an hour and see what happens. Okay, we've let our dough warm up for about an hour. We're going to check it now. This has been covered with a little water and on a little warmth. And as you can see, this has really risen. So our pizza dough is a success. If your dough doesn't rise, you've got a problem. If it doesn't rise, it turns out being more like a cracker. Make like a saltine cracker crust. That's okay too, but I like mine to rise a little bit. Okay, so this part is done. Now we're going to let this sit in the fridge. I let it sit in the fridge myself about 2 hours. If you want really good dough, you can let it sit in the fridge overnight for about 12 hours. What I've noticed though, if you let it sit in too long, I think it dies and it doesn't rise when you bake it in the oven. And again, it comes out like kind of like a cracker crust. So we're just gonna let this sit in the fridge for a couple of hours. You want to make this, before you make your pizza, of course. Plan either a day ahead of time or a couple of hours, whatever. So we're gonna fast forward and put this in the fridge. This is the end of the dough for now. I'm going to show how to either stretch it or you can hand toss it, but I'll show the rest of the dough when I make the pizza.